I have no idea how to start this video, so hi, I'm Duck. Welcome to my channel. I know it's a little empty, but I'm working on fixing that. If you like what I have to say, please let me know. I love getting to nerd out about video games. Over the past few years, Deltarune has become one of my favorite games, and I've been devouring theory videos like they're moss. It took me a while to finish chapters 3 and 4, and the whole time I was trying to form some theories of my own. But as I kept playing, I kept feeling a weird sense of deja vu. At first, I chalked it up to the visuals and writing style, as I had just replayed Undertale, and while Toby Fox has progressed a lot as a game designer and storyteller, he still has a memorable style that carries over between games. But something still felt off about that explanation, like I was missing something, until I completed the optional Gerson fight in Chapter 4. As I went to leave, he had this to say. Before, you said you fancied yourself a hero, didn't you? That's real interesting. Now, I don't know much about heroes, but I know that whatever you call them, there is someone. Someone who will never give up trying to do the right thing, no matter what. There's no prophecy or legend about anyone like that. It's just something I know is true. And just like that, I immediately understood why everything felt so familiar. Because for the maybe 3 people who clicked on a Deltarune video without ever playing Undertale, Gerson's debut appearance was actually as a shopkeeper in Undertale. Like most characters, he has unique dialogue choices if you're in the middle of a no mercy run. One of those options is just labeled hero, and if you select it, he'll say the following. I'm not a hero, but I know there's someone out there. Someone who'll never give up trying to do the right thing, no matter what. There's no prophecy or legend about anyone like that. It's just something I know is true. That someone like that will strike you down. The Deltarune dialogue is a near word-for-word copy of its Undertale counterpart, just recontextualized to fit in its new narrative. And as I took a step back, I realized that it wasn't just this one section of dialogue. Bigger things, like characters, themes, and narrative arcs, they all stemmed from somewhere in Undertale. Just reshaped to fit a new story. And I'm not talking about how some Undertale characters are used as townspeople in Deltarune's Light World. No, I'm talking about characters who appear entirely unique to Deltarune, but when you take a closer look, they seem to take inspiration from other characters. I know that it's been established that Undertale and Deltarune, despite containing similar elements, are separate games. However, I fully believe that Undertale was used as a testing ground for ideas that would later evolve into Deltarune. Here's what I think happened. We already know that Undertale was Toby Fox's testing ground for making an RPG, but that his ideas for Deltarune predate it. I think that he took his rough draft of Deltarune, specifically the characters, and rewrote them as Undertale characters. That way, he could play around with certain themes and character arcs, and figure out how he wanted to depict their personalities and goals. Because of this, I think that taking a new look at Undertale through this lens could help us figure out where Deltarune is heading. Now, before we officially get started, let me run you through the structure of this video. We're going to start with some pretty surface level observations, where I just point at 2 characters and describe what they do or don't have in common. Then we'll have a brief interlude where I put on my Undertale veteran cap and complain about my biggest issues with Undertale and how I think Toby Fox learned from his mistakes. For our deeper analysis, we're going to take a look at Deltarune characters who are important to the narrative or have an incomplete arc, and see if we can predict how their stories will end using their counterparts. Finally, we'll bring everything together along with my final predictions for Chapter 5 and onwards. I was also going to take a stab at the prophecy, because while it's not as important to its narrative, Undertale also has a simpler, recontextualized version of the Deltarune prophecy. However, this video is already long enough, and I made the mistake of waiting until less than a month before Chapter 5 releases to start on this, and I want to make sure this comes out at least a day before it launches. If you want to see a video about the prophecies, that'll probably include anything new we learn in Chapter 5, please let me know. Now, with that out of the way, let's get started. Now, I've been taking a look at these 2 games for a while now, and the more I look, the more I'm convinced that most of the main Undertale characters have a Deltarune counterpart and vice versa. And no, I'm not talking about their body doubles with same name and face. I'm talking about unique to Deltarune characters that match their Undertale counterparts in personality, story role, and or character arc. There are some characters I'm saving for the end, but otherwise we'll start with the most obvious examples and work our way down. I feel like the most obvious connection is Susie and Undyne. They're both seen as brash and violent, and in both cases you have to match them on a physical level before they'll agree to pacifism. I feel like the main difference between them is that while Susie has troubles with authority, Undyne is the authority. Rousey is the next obvious. Despite looking so much like Azrael, it's easy to draw parallels between him and Alphys. They're both shy, friendly types who attach themselves to the player as soon as they meet. They are so helpful that it quickly becomes unhelpful, and they both keep dark secrets at the player's expense. The main difference is that Alphys is a nerd, and most of her helpfulness comes in the form of hacking and gadgetry. Meanwhile, Rousey is more emotionally intelligent, and is your primary source of information for how Dark Worlds work. Next is Papyrus and Lancer. They're both mini-bosses in their respective games, and while they want to complete their respective jobs, capturing the humans and being the bad guy, neither of them are made for that kind of violence. They also both have a good relationship with Susie and Undyne, to the point where they're nervous to admit their pacifism at the chance of being scolded by the scary lady they look up to. Now, when I originally came up with this list, my first thought was to actually pair Rule's card with Papyrus. At the time, it made sense. They're both very passionate about puzzles, but not good at executing them. And let's be real, these voices are some of the most fun ones to dub in their respective games. However, I think Rule's card fits a lot better with Sans. Think about it, they're both incompetent with their everyday jobs, though Sans' seems to stem more from laziness. They both have a close relationship with Lancer or Papyrus, with the skeletons being brothers and Lancer calling Rules his lesser dad. They both have access to funky game mechanics that go against the central gameplay. They can both teleport for no explained reason. And for some reason, they're both the third wheel in the Dreamer divorce? Because let's be honest, we all know that the weird La Niña El Niña rules thing in Chapter 3 was an allegory for Toriel, Asgore, and Sans. I know I just said that all of Undertale's thematic counterparts are not their literal counterparts, but in all honesty, Gerson is just Gerson. There was a popular theory for a while that Sans Deltarune and Sans Undertale were either the same person or somehow swapped places right before the start of their respective games. I want to bring that back, but for Gerson Boo. It's just the same guy copied and pasted across games. They're both old men with knowledge of the past, though Deltarune's version is just a historian, while Undertale's version actually fought in the Human-Monster War, and was alive for all of the game's known history. They both tell the players about the prophecy, they both sell items but never buy. Interestingly, they both seem to know in-game mechanics that most characters don't know. Deltarune's is more obvious. During the portion where Gerson travels with you, if you select him as an act, he'll help you in ways that feel like borderline cheating. Undertale Gerson is a little more subtle. In Undertale, none of the shopkeepers can be harmed, even in the genocide route. If you threaten Gerson during a genocide run, he'll say this: "I've lived too long to be afraid of something like you. Try it, kiddo. I know you can't hear." Haha. Knowledge like that is the only reason I've survived so long. There are some other minor character parallels that come to mind, but they're all either loosely connected or characters that I don't think will have any big moments in future chapters. There are also a lot of major characters, mostly Darkner bosses, who don't seem to have a counterpart. I think this is because these characters were either formed after Undertale's conception, or have no clean way to fit into Undertale's story. The only main character Lightner that also has this problem is Birdly, and in my rough draft I said his counterpart was Monster Kid, but honestly there's not enough evidence to defend it. If you guys have any ideas about him or some of the Darkner bosses, let me know. Maybe I'll do a mini follow-up about them. Now we move on to the big stuff. Ever since Chapter 2 came out, I've been convinced that the Dreamer siblings of Undertale were the prototype of the Holiday Sisters. Now that we've played Chapters 3 and 4, I'm extending that to the whole family. We'll start with the loosest, least obvious examples and work our way up. The first one on the docket is Rudy and Toriel. In all honesty, there isn't much to go on here, simply because we've barely seen anything of Rudy. It doesn't help that Toriel has a very clear role as Undertale's tutorial boss, and is also a clear mother figure to Frisk. Meanwhile, Rudy's presence so far has been very minor, and you have to go out of your way to interact with him. And while being a parent is crucial to part of his character, it's clear that he has little to no parental attachment to Chris. To Rudy, Chris is just his best friend's kid and the weird neighbor that sometimes hangs out with his own kids. We also have to consider his mysterious illness, which has never been a part of Toriel's character. However, for all the differences, there are some parallels to be found. The main connection is their humor. A lot of people only bring it up when talking about her relationship with Sans, but it's clear throughout both Undertale and Deltarune that Toriel's humor predates them ever meeting. She's always been a fan of jokes and puns, and it was her love of humor that led her to befriending the skeleton. Meanwhile, while Rudy doesn't seem to enjoy puns, he's definitely a jokester. Even while sick at the hospital, he's constantly cracking jokes and poking fun at everyone around him. Both characters are also shown to have a protective side, though that might just be because they're both parents. The next holiday dreamer connection I want to focus on is Carol and Asgore. Again, this pairing is difficult because Carol has gotten very little screen time so far, and most of what we have to go on is either speculation or the few things that Noelle has mentioned about her. Likewise, while we get to see a lot of Asgore in Deltarune, he has very little screen time in Undertale outside of his boss battle. Like Carol, most of what we hear about him is through the mouths of other monsters, though we do get a few bonus details to help piece things together. And while Carol and the Deltarune version of Asgore have very little in common, there are a lot more similarities when focusing on his Undertale version. The most obvious connection is their positions of authority. Carol is the mayor of Chris's town, and a lot of monsters mention both how seriously she takes her job and how competent she is as a mayor. In Undertale, Asgore is the king of the underground, and many monsters will bring up how amazing of a king he is. And while people like Papyrus and Gerson describe him as basically a pushover, the version we encounter during the neutral route is anything but. Both characters are also parents who are still grieving the loss of their children. Now, when I say this, I'm not trying to imply that Toriel or Rudy love their children any less. However, it's clear in both Undertale and Deltarune that these characters are taking steps, whether healthy or unhealthy, to move on from this tragedy. Toriel flees to the ruins and becomes the temporary caregiver of anyone who comes through. She's also shown to find happiness in herself again through her friendship with Sans. We don't see as much for Rudy's experience, but it's clear from the way he's able to calmly talk about death that he's made peace with the idea that he'll never see his eldest daughter again. Meanwhile, Asgore and Carol have become near tyrannical in their grief. Asgore, as revenge for killing his children, initiated the human hunting decree, where monsters were encouraged to kill humans and bring him their souls. Meanwhile, with her remaining daughter, Carol somehow straddles the line between helicopter parent and complete neglect, as she's never there when her daughter needs her, but is completely controlling otherwise. And based on the phone calls that Chris gets in the holiday house, it seems like Chris and Carol are working together towards whatever Chris's Dark World goals are. I personally think it's to bring back December, who is somehow lost in one of the Dark Worlds. Now, onto the kids. I'll go more in depth with it later, but I do think that Noelle is supposed to be this game's version of Azrael. We don't get to see much of Azrael in Undertale, as most of our interactions with him are through Flowey, a being with Azrael's memories but no soul, making him unable to feel or express empathy. However, from what little we do get to see of him, it's clear that Azrael was a kind yet scared child who missed his sibling more than anything. And that's exactly who Noelle is. Noelle is shown time and time again to be a kind girl with a heart of gold, and while she's a scaredy cat, she also enjoys horror, as it reminds her of the good times she had with her sister. It's also obvious that she misses December, as she constantly brings her up throughout Chapter 2, and you can see from her search results in Queen's Mansion that she's consistently searching December holiday to see if anyone finds her. Speaking of December, I think it's clear to see where I'm going with this. Her and Kara, despite having little to no screen time across their games, have integral roles in their narratives. They both caused the inciting incident in their stories, with Kara's death and December's disappearance. They were both seen as the edgy or creepy members of the family, and they both had a very close relationship with their sibling. The biggest difference between them so far is that Kara dragged Azrael into their tragedy, leading him to his death and rebirth as Flowey. Meanwhile, Noelle seems entirely unaware of what actually happened to Des. And if you look at the story of Flowey's creation, someone who seemed to witness the tragedy and was directly affected by it, who is now soulless and is doing everything in their power to bring them back, it feels like it's more in line with Chris. But we'll talk more about that later. While on the topic of December being this game's version of Kara, I do want to take a moment to discuss my biggest personal critique of Undertale, the Kara problem. Now, I want to state for the record that I am a Kara apologizer. I fully believe that while what they did was wrong, they were also a self-sacrificing child who didn't understand how their actions would affect the ones they cared about. I also believe that Kara's whole genocide route monologue is a direct result of being tied to a soul that's fueled by both extreme love and determination, both of which have been shown to take even the kindest of people and twist them into hollow versions of themselves that lack empathy or emotions. However, while I do believe this with my full being, I also fully understand why Kara was demonized by the community. There's the obvious reason of not wanting to accept our actions as our own in the genocide route, and Azrael's post-pacifist realization that Kara wasn't the martyr he made them out to be. But I also think there was a more sinister reason for this opinion. A decision in the game that subconsciously skewed the player's bias from the very beginning. The decision to keep Kara a mystery. Despite being such important characters to the plot and history of the game, Azrael and Kara aren't mentioned much. I believe this was because Toby wanted to keep them a secret until the end, especially for the reveals that Flowey is Azrael and the human you name at the beginning of the game is actually Kara, not Chris. However, in a game where every character is either a funny side gag or a deep emotional connection, this choice leads to a weird disconnect between the characters and the players. A big example of this is through Toriel. While she is their mother and would therefore have a lot of grief and feelings about these characters, she's also the tutorial boss of the game. And since Toby wanted their identities to be kept a secret, she just never mentions being a mom. Sure, she's been a mother figure to you and the other humans who've passed through the ruins, but she never mentions the first children that she lost. Asgore does vaguely mention missing his wife and son, but makes no direct mention of Azrael and doesn't acknowledge Kara at all. Outside of this, the two characters are only mentioned 4 times. The flashback cutscene in Waterfall, the history lesson in the new home, the True Labs VHS tapes, and the brief moments when Flowey or Azrael will talk about his past with Kara. For being such important characters, their lack of mention or screen time makes it difficult to empathize with them. Azrael gets around this problem in 2 ways. Not only is he technically still alive through Flowey, so we get much more of his dialogue, but we also get the fight and end cutscene in the pacifist run, which shows that he's just a scared kid grieving the loss of his sibling. However, Kara doesn't get the same treatment. Their only dialogue is when they are full of violence and determination, and as the dead character, they never showcase any form of grief. For a game that seems to really focus on grief and the ability to move on after tragedy, having them be stuck as this looming shadow who's unable to change and let go seems really off. Now, to be completely honest, I've had parts of this theory stewing in the back of my mind for a while now, and while most of my ideas weren't formed until playing Chapter 4, I fully believed that the Holiday Sisters were counterparts of the Dreamer siblings since Chapter 2. When I originally formed that idea, I was worried that Des would also succumb to the Kara problem. That in Toby Fox's desire to keep her disappearance a mystery, he would avoid mentioning her and make her as obscure as Kara was. This, combined with her potentially being the Knight, could cause her to become just as demonized within the fandom. However, now that I've seen Chapters 3 and 4, I'm not as worried about that outcome. While she's also not mentioned much by name, December Holiday has a very strong presence in Deltarune. She's mentioned several times throughout the story, and it looks like many of the problems within the Light World stem from her disappearance. Her room is kept in pristine condition, and it is implied that no one is allowed to touch anything in it. Noelle mentions her pretty regularly, and it's clear throughout Chapters 2 and 4 how much she misses her. She's so shaken up by Des's disappearance that she rarely says her name out loud unless it's just her and Chris, though it's unclear if this is due to trauma or if she's not allowed to mention her sister. Rudy mentions Des once, though he doesn't seem to dwell too much on her disappearance. And while Carol never mentions Des by name, she's still pissed when she catches Susie touching her guitar. You could argue that it's because part of the shelter code is in the guitar, but that raises the question of why she's so protective of the code. As I said before, my personal belief is that December's disappearance is somehow tied to the shelter, and that similar to Gerson, her continued existence is tied to the fountain within. But either way, it's clear that Des will have a much stronger build-up in the narrative than Kara did. But I wanted to voice my opinions on it now, in case it happens anyway. Okay, let's get to theorizing. As I said earlier, we're going to go through all the Deltarune characters we listed, look at how their Undertale counterpart stories ended, then use that to predict their endings. We'll start with the ones who have either already finished their arcs, or won't have a big arc that's relevant to the story. First up is Lancer, and while I hope my bouncy boy appears in future chapters, I don't think he'll have any more character growth. His arc occurred over the course of Chapter 1, and it's just a slightly less comedic version of Papyrus's. He wants to be good at his job, we befriend him, he grows conflicted, and then eventually joins our side through the power of friendship. There's not much to talk about, though if he ends up playing a bigger role, I think it'll be through his friendship with Susie, like how Papyrus kept reappearing throughout Undertale because he wanted to be a good friend to everyone, even at their own expense. Gerson has the same issue. While I love the funny turtle man, his story seems to be completely wrapped up in Chapter 4, and I think his impact on Susie would mean a lot less if we get to see him again. Which is honestly for the best, because he didn't really have a character arc in Undertale either. Next up is Rules Cart, and while it would be extremely funny, I don't think we're going to get a Megalovania type sequence with him. By this point, he's just there to be a goofy side villain who is also somehow a parallel to the guy befriending Chris's mom. And as much as I love him, as we get into more serious chapters, I have a feeling we're going to be seeing less and less of this puzzle-loving second-in-command. He doesn't have any strong character arc to follow through on, which is fitting because while Sans is an interesting character to analyze, he doesn't really have any serious goals or character growth in Undertale. Rudy is where things get interesting. Because he has very little presence within the story, there are a lot of different avenues to be explored. I think there are two main ways it could go. Option 1, we get a bigger exploration of his character, where I think we'll see a much stronger connection to Toriel. Maybe he'll open up about his relationship with his wife, about how she works too hard and is willing to do things that he can't support on a moral level. We've heard him talk a bit about Noelle and Des, so maybe we'll get to see his protective side, where he learns about the Dark World and tries to stop Noelle from helping, similar to Toriel's boss fight in the ruins. Who knows, maybe we'll even get a gender-swapped version of that scene in Undertale, where Toriel beats the shit out of Asgore to protect us. The other route I see is where Rudy doesn't get any major character development, and his role in the story is to just be Noelle's sick father. Maybe he'll die, which will be the final straw and eventual catalyst for the Roaring. He could also get better, but unless he gets character development, it feels like a waste. Carol is also where things get interesting, since her true role and motivations are entirely up to interpretation. As I said before, I think she's working with Chris and maybe the Knight to get December back. And while I know some people think Carol is the Knight, I still think it's going to be Des, just because it would make for a more dramatic reveal for the characters. And honestly, I'm not going to make any serious predictions for her, simply because I don't think her story will end the same way Asgore's did. Asgore is one of the final bosses of Undertale, and unlike most of the other bosses, you don't get to interact with him in any major capacity before his fight. And his fight only ends in one of two ways. In the neutral and genocide run, he dies, and in the pacifist route, he gets bitch-slapped by his ex-wife. And I don't think that'll happen to Carol, because there's one main difference between them: family. In Undertale, Asgore's children are dead, and he has no idea where Toriel is or if she's even alive. He has lost the will to keep going, and is only alive because he is the king and his people need him. Unlike most monsters, he doesn't ask you for mercy when you defeat him. He asks for you to kill him, so he can be reunited with his family in death. Meanwhile, Carol still has her husband and younger daughter to cling on to, and there's a chance that her eldest is still alive. So I don't think there's a scenario where she'd spiral to the point where Asgore did. We'll talk about Des next, because while it's obvious that she has a significant role in the story, her lack of physical presence makes her devoid of any character arc. I feel like her conclusion will go one of two ways, depending on if she's actually the Knight. If she isn't the Knight, I think her role will be similar to Kara's in the Undertale pacifist route. She probably won't be savable, and a lot of these characters are going to have to deal with the fact that no matter what they did and how hard they tried, she's never truly coming back. If she is the Knight, then her role is mostly a mystery until we know what her goals are, but I wouldn't be surprised if they were similar to Kara's. Maybe she saw something as a child that made her disillusioned with the light world, and she set out to right the wrongs that she saw. But then something went wrong, and now she got lost in the dark world. The darkness then corrupted her and molded her into the Knight, a dark entity with no feelings or desires beyond violence and control. Regardless of which path they take, I'm excited to see how her role develops. Now we move on to Rouse. He and Susie are interesting, because not only are they the ones with the clearest narrative arcs, but their arcs also consist of several character facets that they're learning to either overcome or grow into. When breaking it down, I feel like Rouse has three facets to deal with, two of which are parallel to Alfie's. The most obvious one is dishonesty. Alfie's main arc in Undertale was the revelation of her lies, and her steps to be more open and honest with the people around her. And while I don't feel like Rousey has directly lied much throughout Deltarune, he's definitely hid a lot of secrets from Chris and especially Susie. However, I do feel like Chapter 4 addressed a lot of this, and I hope that Chapter 5 concludes this portion of his arc, allowing him to be more open and honest with his friends. The second facet that he shares with Alphys is a sense of responsibility. In both games, these characters were personally burdened with responsibilities that were out of their control. With Alphys, this was external pressure from Asgore to prolong monster life and create artificial souls, which led to the determination experiments. We see this in the True Lab, where we are confronted with the people she accidentally hurt and the consequences of her actions. With Rousey, it's implied that he's been burdened with the knowledge of the prophecy since the moment he gained sentience, which is probably why he assumes that he's one of the heroes of the prophecy. He fully throws himself into this role, Prince from the Dark, at both his expense and others. A good example of this is near the beginning of Chapter 4, where he consistently denies Susie the chance to use her healing magic. Even though he was the one to teach her, and it's very clear that she enjoys healing people, he does not acknowledge her capabilities because 1, his magic is more efficient, and 2, he's assigned himself the role of group healer since Chapter 1. His third character flaw that I feel is unique to his character is his prejudice against Darkners. It's implied that all the Darkners are at least aware of what they are, and that the Lightners help to give them purpose. However, Rousey takes this a step above the rest, likely due to his relationship with the prophecy. Rousey has been shown time and time again to not hold Darkners to the same level as Lightners, to the point where he thinks their only purpose in life is to serve Lightners and to be grateful that the Lightners gave them the opportunity to serve. It's interesting because while many of the Darkners want to serve the Lightners, albeit in their own weird ways, none of them seem to fully agree with Rousey's philosophy. This causes him to feel disconnected from both sides. His conflicting beliefs make him a pessimistic outsider to the Darkners, and he's constantly trying to convince the Lightners that because he's a Darkner, he's not worth caring about. And when you look back at his character, almost every decision that Rousey makes can be related back to these 3 ideals. Rousey is constantly hiding secrets from Chris and Susie, either because he doesn't want them hurt by the truth, or because he's scared that they'll bail once they learn about it. He claims that he kept the true prophecy hidden because if they don't know how it ends, they'll have a better chance at changing it. He's very vocal on his beliefs on both Darkners and the prophecy, and gets upset when people behave in ways that go against the desired outcome. He's constantly changing himself to meet the desires of Susie and Chris, and he's been shown to neglect his own wants to the point where he no longer has any. He's only now starting to learn how to be a person, not just a figure in the prophecy. I fully expect the next chapter to focus on this, with Rousey learning to value both the Darkners around him and himself. And while it's pretty obvious, I do think that Susie will be the catalyst for this. Similar to how Undyne was the one who got Alphys to come out of her shell, Susie has been shown time and time again to push back against both the prophecy and Rousey's self-hatred. She genuinely cares about all of the Darkners, Rousey included, and I'm excited to see how Rousey starts to love himself and those around him through Susie. While now would be a good time to mention Susie, I'm actually going to save her analysis for the end. For now, let's move on to Noelle. I mentioned earlier that Noelle is supposed to represent Azrael, and I do think she's going to have a moment similar to the end of the Pacifist route. In it, Azrael convinced himself that Kara was still alive and living as Frisk. Fueled with determination and his own delusions, he did everything in his power to keep Kara from leaving again, by any means necessary. I think Noelle will have a similar moment trying to bring December back. As for how, my guess is that she'll realize that Des is trapped in the darkness and will create a fountain to try and reach her, which will be the final catalyst for the Roaring. If we're sticking closer to Undertale's script, it won't work, and Noelle will have to come to terms with the fact that her sister is really gone. Meanwhile, I think her Weird Root persona will start to mirror Flowey. The biggest support for this is the infamous Thorn Ring, which, when combined with the Rose animation that used to play in Chapter 4, draws a strong parallel to the Soulless Flower of Undertale. It's also interesting that a lot of her normal emotions and passions are either non-existent or entirely redirected in the Weird Root. For example, in the normal route, Noelle has a crush on Susie, and actively seeks her company any chance she gets. In the Weird Route, she only has eyes for Chris, the one who, as far as she's aware, made her do all the horrible things in the Dark World. The girl we saw in Chapters 1 and 2 is nearly gone, replaced with a hollow caricature of herself. I'm not sure how that'll affect her character, as the Weird Route in general seems disconnected from the normal route, but it's something to keep an eye out for. Now on to Chris. Chris is a very fascinating character, mainly because they seem to be based on multiple aspects of other characters. They have very obvious connections to Kara, with her appearance, knife skills, and unsettling demeanor. They also have obvious connections to Frisk, as a human vessel that the player uses to interact with the world. But unlike Frisk is shown to be entirely independent from us, and even despises the soul to some degree. I also think that similar to Noelle, they have some connection to Flowey. The biggest similarity between Chris and Flowey is that they're both technically soulless. Flowey's circumstances were clearly explained in Undertale. Alphys injected a flower with pure determination to make a vessel to harvest souls in, not knowing that it already contained dust from Asriel's soul. This led to the accidental creation of Flowey, a sentient flower with the memories of Asriel, capable of absorbing both human and monster souls, but possessed no soul of his own. The origins of Chris's soullessness are still a mystery, but I think most of it has already been foreshadowed. In Chapter 2, it's implied that Chris saw something occur near the shelter, something that no one else believes and they refuse to bring up. I think this incident is the disappearance of Des and the loss of their soul. It would make sense. It's implied that Chris was close to Des before her disappearance, and if the incident at the shelter led to Des transforming into the Knight, this would explain the weird connection between Chris, the Knight, and Carol. Chris wants to help bring Des back, so they don't openly attack the Knight and help make fountains. Carol also wants to help bring December back, and uses the incident to guilt Chris into helping. This would also fit well with Des being a parallel for Kara, with her actions causing her disappearance and the loss of Chris's soul. Last but not least, let's talk about Susie. Susie is honestly my favorite character to analyze, simply because she has the clearest arc in the entire game. Similar to Undyne, Susie's arc in Chapter 1 is her learning to accept pacifism and not jump straight to violence. They both require you to battle them head-on to join your side, and they both are known as loud, boisterous, and angry individuals, and they have some of the best boss music in their respective games. But it gets interesting when we move on to Chapter 2, because she's no longer a Violet tormentor learning how to be an ally. No, she's a bright-eyed teenager in a new world, learning how to be a hero. She's constantly engaging with the Dark Worlds on a level above Chris and Rousey, actually talking to the main Darkners of each world and sympathizing with some of their motives. But despite this, she doesn't fall neatly into place. In Chapter 2, she breaks out of her mold as the attack-heavy hero, learning how to act and heal with no prompting from the player. She didn't need to learn the skills, and she probably wasn't supposed to either, but she did anyway. She's the hero that's supposed to wear ribbons, but she refuses to re-quit them. When she first sees the prophecy in Chapter 4, Susie is super for it, running between the rooms as she tries to unravel her destiny. But when she realizes how bleak the ending is, she's immediately against it, trying to convince everyone that it's not set in stone and that they can change it. She's fully enveloped herself into this world, but she doesn't allow it to change her. Instead, she changes the world to fit her story, a narrative of hope and triumph over evil. And the next evolution of her character? I think it was hinted at in the Gerson fight. During this fight, he asks Susie how she wants this story to end. When she claims she never wants it to end, he has this to say: "At this late hour, with the bells ringing out their justice, you choose eternity. Miss, hold dearly to that thought, for the tides of fate are drawing close, and soon the ocean of ink shall wash across the pages. But there is one thing that can overwrite the dark, a white pen known as hope. Miss, I believe this is what you hold." And when she wins this fight, Gerson gifts her with the Justice Axe. It's an interesting name, especially when you look over at Undyne's fight in Undertale. The soundtrack that plays during the normal run is called Spear of Justice. Now what does this all mean? I think that Susie's arc will end with her becoming the Deltarune version of Undyne the Undying. In Undertale, Undyne was trained by Asgore to become a hero for monster kind, a protector that swore to avenge her people by any means necessary. I think Susie is rising to do the same. She's already completed the first few steps. She's been trained by a powerful opponent, she's gained a weapon of justice, and she's been embracing her hero role in the prophecy. She is the embodiment of everyone's hopes and dreams, and I think it's going to go a step further. In Undertale, by the time you meet Undyne, she has already become the head of the Royal Guard and the hero of monster kind. However, when you go to fight her, you'll get two different versions depending on if you've used violence. If you're playing normally, Undyne is a cocky, self-assured hero who constantly taunts you. She gets upset if you try to run away or don't block her attacks. She's one of, if not the only monster in Undertale that can attack you outside of a proper fight, a mechanic that becomes a staple in Deltarune. She's also the first monster where the strategy of talk to them until their name turns yellow doesn't work. Instead, you have to constantly run from her, eventually leading her to Hotlands where she quickly gets overheated. It's only then where you can show mercy and stop the fight in a positive way. This fight in general feels like a combination of chapters 1 and 4 Susie, where neither one truly fits. Chapter 1 Susie doesn't have the same hopes and dreams, nor does she have any true status as a hero. Meanwhile, Chapter 4 Susie no longer views violence as the only solution, and even despises it in some circumstances. For example, near the halfway point of Chapter 4, you fight a figure in the darkness. The figure is later revealed to be a statue from Gerson's study, but during the fight, Susie's convinced that this is Gerson. If you try to make Susie attack, she will refuse, and the option will be grayed out during her next turn. If Chris tries to attack, she will stop Chris, wasting both of your turns and causing 0 damage. By this point in the story, Susie has evolved from attack everything regardless of what we say, to trust Chris' judgment implicitly, to trust Chris but will step in if they do something that she doesn't morally agree with. This disconnects her from Undyne's character in her normal fight, but it does set her up to mirror Undyne the Undying. Undyne the Undying is a boss version of Undyne that you can only face in the genocide route of Undertale. When you try to kill Monster Kid, an option that's only available in the genocide route and is for me the true point of no return, Undyne will step in and take the attack head on, a move that would have killed her if she wasn't filled with so much natural determination. She knows that if she lets you win, you will kill the entire underground. So she takes one last stance and becomes Undyne the Undying, a ruthless warrior whose only goal is to strike you down. This is the second hardest fight in the genocide route and easily one of the top 5 hardest fights in the game. Remember in the beginning of this video where I mentioned a line of dialogue that Gerson has that's nearly identical across both games? That mini monologue talks about a hero, one outside of any legends or prophecies, one that will never give up trying to do the right thing no matter what. In Deltarune, the context of the dialogue implies that he thinks Susie will be the hypothetical hero, one that will do her best to save the world, not because she is destined to, but because she cares too much to see it fall into ruin. Meanwhile, in Undertale, Gerson is talking about a hero who will be the one to strike you down. He says this in the genocide run, and I fully believe he is referring to Undyne the Undying in this moment, especially because her boss music for this fight is named Battle Against a True Hero. Because of this, I think we are going to have another confrontation against Susie, one where she takes one last stand, whether against us or against Chris. But this time, instead of fighting because she thinks she's the bad guy, she'll fight because she knows she's the hero. I think we can even predict why this fight will happen. In the weird route, it's easy, because she's eventually going to learn that we've been forcing Chris and Noelle to do some truly despicable things. And in the normal route, not only have we been unintentionally lying to Susie about Chris and their soul being different entities, but Chris seems to have different goals that conflict with the prophecy. In all honesty, I wouldn't be surprised if Chris tries to start the roaring in order to accomplish their goals, whether it's bringing Des back or something more nefarious. In both instances, Susie would feel the need to step up as a hero and fight her first true friend, in order to protect the world she had grown so fond of. And while I said I wouldn't talk too much about the prophecy, the one shattered panel could have been something obvious, like the Dark World's getting sealed off forever, but I think it would be interesting if it said that the heroes would ultimately betray each other. This, of course, would be something that both Susie and Rousey are strongly against, which is why Susie refuses to acknowledge that it could come true, and why Chapter 1 Rousey was so focused on preventing Susie from becoming a true enemy. However, we'll just have to wait until more chapters release to see if this is true. Alright, I know that a lot of my points felt really disjointed because it was separated by character, so here's a list of what I think will happen based on how Undertale played out in order of when I think it will happen. Chapter 5, as we can see in the trailer, will most likely take place at Asgore's flower shop. If I had to guess, this will be the chapter that focuses on the incident that led to Des's disappearance, the loss of Chris's soul, and the Dreamer divorce. Now that Susie knows the entire prophecy, I think this will be the point where Rousey finally opens up about everything he knows, giving us both useful and useless information about Dark Worlds and the surrounding prophecy. I also think Susie's going to try and ignore the information she learned in previous chapters, specifically that the Lightners are all just objects and cannot exist in the light world. All in all, I think this chapter will focus less on the future and more on the past, fleshing out backstories and trekking up feelings of bittersweet nostalgia for both the characters and the audience. It'll be pretty lighthearted but mostly tensionless, with everyone focused on having one last fun adventure before everything goes to hell. This is their beach episode, let them have it. I think Chapter 6 will focus on the Holiday family. This is where we'll learn the true motivations of Chris, the Knight, and Carol. If Rudy has his own character arc or is used as a plot device, I think this is where it'll happen. If Noelle opens a portal of her own, which I'm confident she will, it'll probably happen at either the beginning or the end of this chapter. If it's in the beginning, it'll probably happen at her house, where we'll see the history of this family laid bare by the items who witnessed it. I'd personally really like to see a Dark World of December's room. Not only does it have so much history and personality, it's also been sitting untouched ever since her disappearance. How would that translate into the Dark World? Would everything maintain its too cool for school aesthetic, with just a hint of boredom and loneliness? Or would everything feel hollow and empty, caked in a thick layer of dust? Rousey mentioned that a Darkner's purpose is to serve their Lightener. Would the absence of death cause them to gain more freedom, or lose a piece of themselves with her? Either way, it would be an interesting avenue to explore. If Noelle decides to create a fountain at the end of the chapter, I think it'll be at the festival. Not only has the festival been teased for the majority of the game, it would be a grand spectacle that could hypothetically cause the roaring, which would answer the question of, what would happen if a fountain was made outside? I don't know what the Dark World would possess, since the festival has only been teased up to this point, but I think it would lead to an interesting scenario. The only other option I could see for Noelle opening a portal would be if Rudy dies, and she'll open a portal to wherever her dad is, which will most likely be the hospital. The only interesting thing I could see for this Dark World is during the Weird Route, where we would find a frozen Birdly somewhere. I also think, regardless of which option occurs, this will be the chapter where Azrael comes home. It's implied that he and Des had a very close relationship prior to her disappearance, and I think he could give good context for who December was as a person and what her motivations might be. Additionally, I'm hoping that Chapter 6 is where Rousey finally starts to value Darkners on the same level as Lightners. I'm not sure how this arc will play out, but I really want him to start valuing himself and his people. Finally, I think this will be the chapter where Chris's allegiances are exposed, and they'll be forced to choose between the knight and the heroes. I think it would be a really good cliffhanger if Chris either forces the soul in a position where they can't fight back, or abandons it with Susie and they go join the knight's side. As for Chapter 7, I think it's going to take place in the shelter. It's where everything's been leading to, and it would honestly be weird if this wasn't where the final chapter takes place. I think the final Susie fight will either take place in the shelter, or on the path leading up to it. I've seen a lot of people theorize and interpret that a fight in the Light World would act like an Undertale fight, and I think that would be both nostalgic enough to bring back old players, and mix it up enough to bring back new players. If we get an Undyne the Undying-esque moment, similar to where Undyne protected Monster Kid, I think it'll happen here. Maybe it could be Susie protecting Lancer from us or Noelle. Speaking of Noelle, I think this chapter will be where she reaches her tipping point, and tries to go nuclear in her attempts to bring December back. This will also be where we learn whether or not Des can actually be saved, though my money's on no. For my final prediction, I first need to talk about the themes of Undertale and Deltarune. One of the largest themes of both games is grief, and moving on from loss. While it's not in the forefront of the story, it's very obvious in Undertale. The loss of the Dreamer children caused irreparable damage, which can be seen years later in the Human Hunting Decree. Monsters that never had the chance to meet these children are still affected by the grief of those who did, from Asgore's law to kill humans, to Toriel's sanctuary in the ruins, to Flowey's determination to bring Kara back. But in the end, it didn't matter, because Kara is dead, and Azrael is mostly gone, and the best thing they can do is mourn and move on. Deltarune seems to be shaping up to a similar conclusion. The Dark Worlds in general seem to represent an idealistic world where they can escape their everyday life. For Susie, it's a place where she can be revered as a hero instead of a villain. For Noelle, it's a place where she can have fun and forget about her grief. We don't know what the Dark Worlds mean to Chris yet, but since a lot of Chapter 3 seem to focus on escapism to the point of detriment, I think they also think of this as a way to escape their home life. Which is why, if I had to guess, I think Chapter 7 will end in one of two ways. Option 1. It ends on a happier note and finds a way to keep the Dark World around without causing the roaring. Who knows, maybe the roaring itself will cause the two worlds to become permanently entwined, so even after the Titans are defeated, the Darkners are still able to exist within the Light World. Option 2. We get a more bittersweet ending, where all of the Dark Worlds must be sealed to stop the roaring for good. While I hope this isn't how it'll end, it would make the most narrative sense. I also think that Des probably won't be savable, or if she is, she won't be the same person everyone lost. She, along with everyone else, has changed, morphed by time and grief and darkness. That's all my predictions for now. Please let me know what you think in the comments. I'm really excited to hear what you think, and I'm excited to see how Chapter 5 actually plays out. I'm trying to post this a day or two before it launches, though I won't actually get to play Chapter 5 for another 2 weeks due to work and scheduling conflicts. If you'd like to hear how I think Chapter 5 fits into this theory, or my thoughts on the prophecy, please let me know. Maybe I'll make another video about it. Until then, I hope you enjoyed me rambling for way too long, and I'll see you next time.